Shall we start? Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. This is the third webinar in the GGR Insights series hosted by the Core Hub, where we present the latest research and discuss what is needed to enable the sustainable scale-up of greenhouse gas removals, or GGR, in the UK. I'm Aline Soterroni, a research fellow at the Nature-Based Solutions and Oxford Net Zero initiatives, and I have recently joined the Core Hub. I'll be chairing today's webinar, which focuses on an important question: what types of carbon dioxide removals, or CDRs, are nature-based solutions? Before we dive in, just a quick reminder. All the webinars in this GGR Insights series are being recorded and will be available on the Core website. It means you can revisit this conversation later and share the link with your colleagues. And for those of you who may be new to the Core Hub, it is the UK's national research effort on greenhouse gas removal. Funded through UK Research and Innovation's Strategic Priorities Fund as part of the Greenhouse Gas Removal Demonstrators Program, Core coordinates activities across the whole program and delivers multidisciplinary solutions-driven research on greenhouse gas removal. Today, we'll be talking about CDRs and nature-based solutions. According to the IPCC, alongside deep emissions reductions, CDRs will be necessary to achieve net zero emissions and limit global warming to below 2 degrees or less. But there are different types of CDRs, different CDR methods and implementation options, and depending on the scale and deployment, they could have co-benefits or negative side effects. At the same time, there is an increasing awareness to address the climate and biodiversity crisis in tandem. To help clarify these methods and their associated risks, especially around which types of CDRs qualify as nature-based solutions, I'm delighted to welcome John Lynch as our first speaker. John is currently a research fellow in the Agile Initiative at the Oxford Martin School, but until very recently, he was a research associate here at Core. John is an environmental scientist whose work focuses on linking carbon removal interventions with improved indicators of biodiversity and ecological functioning. Today, John will give a 15-minute presentation, followed by quick reflections from our two invited speakers, Ruth Gregg and Harley Stoddart. I'm delighted that we get to have with us Ruth, who is a senior analyst covering land, agriculture, and nature at the UK Climate Change Committee. She's currently leading the land use analysis to support the 7th Carbon Budget Advice. And before joining the CCC, Ruth spent over 12 years at Natural England, where she worked on habitat restoration, farm advice, heritage landscapes, and nature-climate interactions, both in the north of England and nationally. And I'm also delighted to have Harley Stoddart, the head of climate mitigation science at Defra. As the scientific lead on climate mitigation, Harley's work spans agriculture, forestry, peatlands, and F-gases. He brings deep expertise in using scientific evidence to inform policy, especially in areas such as agri-environmental schemes and sustainable intensification. Ruth and Harley will be sharing their reflections right after John's presentation, and we would really love to hear your thoughts as well. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom window, you should see the Q&A function. So please feel free to use it at any time to send your questions. And if you see questions that you like, please upvote them. We'll do our best to get through as many as possible during the Q&A time. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to John, who will kick things off with his presentation. John, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Aline, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm assuming you can see my slides okay, so I'll kick off. So in this short presentation, I'm going to run through what nature-based solutions actually are, think about some of the range of carbon removals that are out there or kind of being developed and what their potential is to be nature-based solutions. Then go on to think of kind of some of the systemic considerations of what role do nature-based solutions have in achieving our climate targets. So a nature-based solution over the past decade or so has moved from a kind of broad concept to an actually quite narrowly defined thing that you have to do. So I'm not going to read out this whole definition here, but just it's there if you want to dig in. And this is kind of the most agreed upon definition, which was came out of the United Nations Environment Assembly in 2022. Following this, and also as a framework to try and navigate whether your project is a nature-based solution, the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, put out a standard for nature-based solutions. So this is a framework to help you kind of design and undertake a management which is hopefully a nature-based solution. And to count as a nature-based solution, you have to meet 8 different criteria. So they are actually quite specific, and you have to be achieving kind of multiple things in the aim, outcomes, and design. I'm not going to go through all of these, but what I'm really going to focus on for this talk is this criteria 3. So to be a nature-based solution, whatever you're undertaking has to demonstrably advantage biodiversity. So obviously it's a solution to some kind of societal challenge. This framework suggests a range of challenges that are kind of worth and important contributing to. For carbon removals or other greenhouse gas removals, it's clear there that our challenge we're trying to address is climate change mitigation. So if we are demonstrably achieving carbon removals, then that's how we are contributing to that particular societal challenge. So if our practice is doing that carbon removal, then we can tick off that first criterion, although we do have to kind of document, monitor, and have a scientific basis for anticipating why and how that carbon removal is going to occur. And then, yes, the third criteria, as I flagged up, is that nature-based solutions should result in a net gain to biodiversity and ecosystem integrity. So we have to be setting out to do something which achieves our societal aim, so removes carbon, and is net positive for biodiversity and ecosystem function. And if we're not doing both of those things and more, as said in the wider criteria, which are things like equitable governance, having the buy-in and support of local communities, if we're not doing those, then it's not a nature-based solution. Just to flag up for anyone in the audience who may be interested, as well as this standard, the IUCN have a guidance document which can be useful to see, how do we actually go about designing and assessing something if we want it to be a nature-based solution. Okay, so with that in mind, in the context of what a nature-based solution is, I'm now going to provide a very whistle-stop tour across a range of carbon removals and consider how and when they might be able to, well, A, generate removals, and B, meet those biodiversity criteria to be genuine nature-based solutions. So the first category is habitat restoration. So these are kind of the most straightforwardly obvious in that they could and should be able to operate as nature-based solutions. So if we have reforestation, peatland restoration, or coastal restoration, we're hoping to remove and store carbon in those habitats as they're restored. And that ecological restoration, the biodiversity benefit, is also one of the core aims. So these, if they achieve those outcomes, would clearly be nature-based solutions that are contributing to climate change mitigation. But we can't just do this and assume that we're getting those goods. So for following the criteria, we still do need to have an evidence-based approach to what we're setting out to do in the management to restore, and then confirm that we are actually getting those benefits. If we then move on through the next kind of few biology related carbon removal methods, there's two that I've kind of categorized here as forest management. So afforestation, as potentially distinct from reforestation, is planting trees where they either weren't present or weren't present recently or may not be ecologically expected. Whereas improved forest management is kind of changing your forestry operations to achieve some kind of outcome. So both of these, they could and hopefully would provide carbon removals, but it really depends on what you're setting out to do with them. So whereas reforestation is kind of straightforwardly should be beneficial for carbon and ecology, because the habitat kind of would be forest anyway, and then we've changed it. In afforestation, if we're planting kind of non-native species, then there's actually a risk that we might lose carbon, at least over some time frames, because we may have things like highly organic grassland soils that actually lose a chunk of carbon once you start planting trees. And similarly, whether or not that transition is good or bad for biodiversity and ecosystems depends where you are, what the land use transition is, and what species you're planting. Forest management also comes down to the details of what you're doing. So in some of the carbon focused scenarios of what you can get out of improved forest management, it's basically changing your thinning rates, getting more wood offtake, which could be good for carbon purposes if you're getting trees to grow faster. Depends what you're doing with that carbon as well. Come on to later if it's going into BECCS or something. But if you're doing that and removing wood that could sit there as dead wood, then that probably isn't beneficial for biodiversity. So there's probably a balance to strike in terms of what your forestry management is doing for carbon and biodiversity. Then there's kind of sets of agroecological practices, so changing farm management to bring in more ecological approaches. So soil carbon sequestration on farms, so reducing tillage, maybe having pasture integrated in crop rotations. This should, and there's a decent evidence base that we can increase carbon in soils through that, with the caveat that it's finite. So the soil will saturate at a certain level of carbon and could be lost in the future based on climate change or changes in management again. It should also provide benefits to biodiversity and ecosystem function. But again, this depends on if you're kind of just carbon focused or if your carbon sequestration is supporting wider soil health and management. Agroforestry, which I'm considering here as a very broad term, basically any incorporation of trees in agriculture. You could potentially get carbon stored in those trees, but there is a potential trade-off in, yeah, what might you be losing in the current soil carbon? Again, depends where you set it up and what you're trying to achieve from it. Still within the kind of biological side and potentially interacting with agriculture, we then have potential carbon removals through soil amendments. So we could add biochar, which is essentially a form of combusted biomass to form charcoal, which should be durable, lock up that carbon in the soil in that biochar itself. Looks like there's decent removal potential there, although there's ongoing research to see just how long does it last. And there's a growing evidence base that this can also support soil health and soil biodiversity, although it's not clear if this is a kind of a universal benefit of biochar or to what extent it depends on what your soil conditions are or even the interaction with the type of biochar that you're spreading. Then there's enhanced rock weathering. So this is where we're crushing up certain rock types and then apply that rock dust over mainly speculated as agricultural land, but could be anywhere really. And then this speeds up kind of natural rock weathering cycle, and then you do get carbon removed through that. There are some considerations about, yeah, does some of that carbon get re-released as it flows out through rivers into the ocean? Also depends on kind of energy use because you have to crush up and distribute those rocks, but should be able to provide carbon removal. It's unclear at the moment about what it means for biodiversity and ecosystem function. So there's potential positives in terms of, again, improving soil health and function, but also maybe negatives, especially if the rock dust may be contaminated with heavy metals that are detrimental to soil biodiversity. Moving from the land to the ocean, so some of the removals that have been posited for the ocean are kind of fertilizing, mostly with iron, potentially other compounds, to increase biological activity. So that this, you would get a kind of bloom in plankton, algal growth, and then this kind of escalates the so-called biological carbon pump, where you have photosynthesis, and then that rains down, accumulates in sediments, building up carbon on the ocean floor. Generally, this is expected to be negative, because when you're fertilizing, you're getting that algal bloom. It may be disrupting whatever that ecosystem is at the moment, which is adapted to low nutrient inputs. So it probably could remove carbon, although whether there's kind of ecosystem feedbacks that limit that is unclear at the moment. But yeah, not really expecting it to be a nature-based solution, because we think it's probably more negative rather than positive for biodiversity ecosystems. Ocean alkalinity enhancement. So one of the consequences of our elevated CO2, as well as causing global warming, is that more of that is dissolved in the oceans and increases ocean acidity. If we add alkaline substances to the ocean, we can reverse some of that ocean acidity, and then this can help increase mineralized carbon stored in the ocean and in sediments. So kind of makes sense from a carbon removal perspective. It's still a bit unclear if there's ecosystem feedbacks and to what extent they may limit the total removal potential. It's also very unclear what this means for biodiversity and ecosystem function. So some habitats are kind of struggling under both warming and increased acidity, and alkalinity enhancement could reverse that acidity increase and help the ecosystems maintain or recover. But local alkalinity excesses are probably negative for the ecosystem, so it may be context dependent, and yeah, further work to really understand what will happen if we do this. Moving on to the final category of removals I'm going to talk through today. So methods that end up putting carbon into geological storage. So first we have BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So the idea here is you grow trees, other biomass, you burn them for energy, but then as you burn them, you're capturing the carbon and then pumping that underground for long-term geological storage. So this should be able to provide removals and continued removals, because whereas a forest regrows, the carbon saturates as the ecosystem matures. In BECCS, you're kind of repeatedly removing the biomass, putting it underground. Another tree regrows, you can continue putting it underground. But the timing and the scale of what carbon removal benefit you get is quite contingent on the feedstock, and also all sorts of complicated questions about the counterfactual. So yes, you are removing carbon, but how much carbon are you removing compared to if you just kept the biomass in the ecosystem? So when would it actually saturate, and when do you get the benefit versus the offtake from the ecosystem? It's also unclear at the moment, or not necessarily unclear, but it depends on the specific rollout, whether this is going to be good or bad for biodiversity and ecosystems. So some of the large-scale scenario models, they kind of report an enormous area of land being converted to biomass to go into BECCS. And this kind of large-scale intensive biomass production land use would be most likely to quite negatively affect biodiversity and ecosystem function. So there's a scale to what's going to be viable from a biodiversity perspective, but that doesn't mean it's inherently bad. And actually, in some locations, if you've got kind of degraded ex-arable intensive agricultural land, then it could be that planting a biomass crop there really could be a nature-based solution if you have a positive transition. So it really depends on the scale and the specifics there. And then finally, direct air carbon capture and storage. So this is where we're kind of pumping carbon through fans, dissolving it in an adjuvant, and then so straight from the atmosphere rather than growing through biomass and then putting that captured carbon also into geological storage. So this is kind of a very direct way of imagining carbon removal, which should work. The balance kind of depends on how decarbonized the energy system is, because it requires energy to pump your gas through the air through to concentrate CO2 to capture. So if the energy system is entirely renewables, then that's less of an issue. If it isn't, there's a trade-off in using energy versus getting the carbon storage out of it. But I think it would be very hard to argue that DAX is a nature-based solution, because you set up your facility, then there may be impacts further down the chain or upstream in the chain from getting the energy use, supplying some of the reagents. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, and it doesn't have a potentially important role in carbon removal, but because it isn't actively supporting biodiversity, then it doesn't really count as a nature-based solution. Okay, so that was our zoom through various removal methods and how they, well, an optimistic look at how they could be nature-based solutions. So how do we kind of understand this better and support the deployment of methods which are nature-based solutions? So I think, as I flagged up there's quite a lot of uncertainties and context-specific aspects to whether things really are good, or even whether they're good or bad for nature. So I think we do need continued research, and especially to look at, if you're deploying a carbon removal method, what are the implications for biodiversity and ecosystems? And as those removals are generated, it's really important we have monitoring, reporting, and verification, or MRV, so that we're kind of continually assessing, what is this practice doing for the carbon balance? Is it actually removing carbon? Is that carbon staying locked up? And also, if it's a nature-based solution, although ideally for any practice, extend that MRV to look at the ecological side as well. So if you're generating a carbon credit, then yeah, there should be an expectation that you're not just doing something and then washing your hands of it. There's a kind of consistent MRV there. I think overall, what we have a lack of, or at least historically we have, is quite isolated thinking across the kind of climate and nature objectives. As we've seen in what the practices actually are, land use and competition for land use is a really important underpinning factor across how we achieve either our climate targets or our nature targets, or hopefully we start thinking of them in a slightly more integrated way. So then it's, okay, we need a certain amount of land to achieve carbon through generating these removals. How can we do that in a way that maximizes the nature advantages as well? And there's interesting ways in which we could kind of set up policies and frameworks to support that. So I'm not gonna go into this too much today, but it's things like whether we permit or what kind of schemes we set up, or incentivize. So you could have kind of stacking or bundling of credits. So if you're doing something which is good for both carbon and biodiversity, how can you be rewarded for the fact you're getting kind of two positive outcomes, multiple credits versus just a kind of isolated benefit for one or the other, which would, or could you lead people to kind of do the lowest common denominator, and, well, I'm only going to get credited for one thing, so I'm not going to care about the other stuff. So what's the kind of role of nature-based solutions in wider climate change mitigation, and what are we missing at the moment? So I think all of the methods that I ran through there probably have an important part to play in achieving our climate change targets, and that's whether they're NBS or not. So if they are nature-based solutions, that's great. We've got a kind of win-win. They should be encouraged. But to meet our climate change targets, we will most definitely require further emission reductions. So in the background to all this, if we don't decarbonize energy supply, then it kind of doesn't matter what else we do, because we won't ever be able to generate enough removals. Even if we did, well, we do have to do that anyways. Even if we were very successful in decarbonising quite rapidly, we probably wouldn't get enough removal capacity just through nature-based solutions. So there is a role for the other methods. And then it becomes a question of, okay, across the whole range of carbon removals we can deploy, we probably want to prioritize those that are actively good for nature and generating removals. For the others that maybe have negative trade-offs, then we still might need to deploy them to get the carbon removal, but how can we do that in a way that minimizes those negative trade-offs? A big issue here is that there's a lack of data across greenhouse gas removal methods on what their wider impacts are, and that's their wider positive or their wider negative impacts, so co-benefits or trade-offs. And just flagging up a paper here from led by a colleague in core, Isabella Butner. So we reviewed kind of life cycle assessment literature on different greenhouse gas removals, and although a decent chunk of them were looking at impact across multiple categories, many of them looked at no additional impact, so it was just focused on the carbon balance, and then the majority only had a limited subset of other wider effects they were looking at. So to summarize then, you may not have been familiar with this going in, but hopefully it's established now that nature-based solutions, there is a clear definition and there's a set of criteria to follow. It's not just a kind of loose concept of doing something that involves biology. If you are to be a nature-based solution, then you need to aim for multiple benefits and do it in an equitable and just way. And one of those multiple benefits has to be demonstrably benefiting biodiversity. And you have to actually kind of monitor to show you're achieving this as well. As we've worked through, the scale dependence and the site-specific manner means that for something to be considered a nature-based solution or not really has to be done at the project level. So we can't classify whole removal categories as either nature-based solutions or not nature-based solutions. It really depends on the specific implementation, and a lot of it depends on to the area it's being undertaken, and what is that area ecologically suited to. If it involves a land use transition, what are you transitioning to and from? And although I think nature-based solutions have an important role in meeting our climate targets and should be encouraged, we probably do also need to recognise that they're only going to be one component of the wider action needed to meet the Paris Agreement. So thank you very much for listening. I look forward to the comments from the other panelists and your questions. I just want to say thanks to all the colleagues in CORE, GGRD, Agile Initiative and Oxford Net Zero. And the parts of my research that this builds on is through these two NOAA grants. So one for the CORE grant and one for Changing the Environment Agile grant. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. I found it particularly helpful to understand that for carbon dioxide removal to qualify as nature-based solution, it must deliver multiple benefits, especially for biodiversity. Now, I'm pleased to hand it over to Ruth. Ruth, you are at the UK Climate Change Committee, leading the land use analysis to support the 7th Carbon Budget Advice. So we'd love to hear your reflections on what John has just presented. Over to you, Ruth.
Thank you, Aline, and many thanks to John as well for that very comprehensive overview of nature-based solutions and how they align with carbon dioxide removals. So I think John has gone into the detail of what they are, so I don't need to do that at all. But I think, kind of reiterating the message that, John was putting across, how context dependent they are. So based on this, I was going to offer a few words on how we consider them within our analysis at the CCC. So again, I think it's worth repeating the point, we need to be realistic around what nature-based solutions can deliver in terms of the scale of emissions reduction. We need all sectors to continue on the path of decarbonisation. And based on this, I'll refer people back to the CCC 7 Carbon Budget Advice that came out in February this year. In this, we show that residual emissions from sectors that can't decarbonise completely, so these include agriculture, aviation, waste and industry, these fall to around 65 megatons of CO2 equivalent by 2050. And in the committee's advised pathway to meet future carbon budgets and net zero, these are offset by a combination of land-based actions and engineered removals. And the land removal part of that offers around half of kind of the reduction that we need to see in 2050. This is around 30 megatons of CO2 equivalent. So really important part of the puzzle, but not the only one. We kind of need this whole picture to kind of continue pulling together. But for our land-based actions and for nature-based solutions to be effective, we need them to deliver emissions reduction up to and beyond 2050. A certain amount of climate change and warming is now locked in. And this is in turn is going to affect how habitats and ecosystems and our land capture and store carbon long term. So this is something that we very much need to plan for, but it remains really uncertain on how that's going to play out over the kind of the next few decades. And again, I think, it's already been picked up in John's presentation, a number of these techniques, while, we can be fairly confident they will lead to emissions abatement, they are very difficult to quantify. So the need for research data so we can fully embed them into our emission reduction pathways really does need to be kind of supported and continued. But I think the role of nature-based solutions kind of helps us navigate some of this uncertainty. We need to kind of ask the question, how do we ensure that these actions are resilient and deliver wider benefits than just carbon? And nature-based solutions approach and the framework that John's presented supports this. And it's going to prevent us getting siloed into prioritising one outcome over the other. And I think one of the first principles around this is almost like a no regrets principle, really, is around kind of protecting and restoring existing land and marine based habitats and systems. So the carbon stocks in these, in the cases of peatlands, grasslands or woodlands, these may have taken hundreds of years, possibly thousands of years to be built up. So by protecting these and building their resilience, we're both protecting the biodiversity, but we're also helping these systems be resilient and hopefully continue to sequester carbon into the future. I guess the second kind of principle we need to consider is, around kind of how we drive land use change and kind of what the wider benefits and how do we do this holistically. So in terms of how we focus this, framing through nature-based solutions kind of helps us reflect that we are land to deliver such a wide range of actions, but it's constrained. We only have a certain amount of land and it's currently all under use. So there is going to be benefits and trade-offs in this. And then, so nature-based solutions, very much need to be targeted in landscapes where they can be most effective. And this ultimately kind of comes down to being quite spatially dependent. Where they are in the landscape is really going to drive the outcomes that we see from applying these actions. So as part of this, we need to ensure that there's incentives and support in place for farmers and land managers and communities to deliver the land use change that's acceptable to them, but also at the same time is able to deliver societal benefits. And I think this is kind of where the socio-economic aspects of nature-based solutions can really start to weave through and become quite important. I'm going to hand over to the speaker in a minute, but before I do, I guess another thing just to kind of end on is that, if we're going to see effective, high integrity nature-based approaches, these aren't quick fixes. There's very likely going to be a lag between delivering the action and seeing the benefits, being it for carbon sequestration or kind of the other benefits that we want to see. So we very much need to upscale implementation on that now, and having kind of a clear long-term incentive framework to delivering this is going to be crucial. And this is what we're starting to see kind of being emerging across the UK, through kind of the post-cap agri-environment schemes. The upcoming land use framework will hopefully kind of really help kind of guide the right actions in the right place. And I think another piece of the puzzle as well is kind of supporting farmers and land managers to do this will be kind of the role of private finance. But I think this is kind of another area where there's still maybe some uncertainty. So before I pass on, I guess just to say lots of challenges, but also lots of opportunities as well. And very much looking forward to discussing it with the panel and via the Q&A. So I will hand over to Aline to introduce Harley.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for those thoughtful reflections, challenges, and opportunities. And before we move on to Harley, just a quick reminder to everyone watching to please use the Q&A function and feel free to upvote questions you find interesting. We'll come to them very soon. Now, I'd like to hand over to Harley. Harley is the scientific lead at Defra on climate mitigation, so it will be good to hear your take on, given your valuable practical experience. Over to you, Harley.
Thank you very much, Aline. And thank you for having me. Yes, audience, please do ask questions. We love questions. Okay, John, I thought your presentation was great. And the comments, they're really clear. In fact, the whole program has been great. It's a really robust piece of work. And to that, shout out to all the researchers involved and all my Defra and DESNES colleagues involved as well. It's really important to lay out what we know and what we don't know in order to help decision makers to make decisions, regardless of whether those decision makers are ministers, policy officials, or farmers and land managers. Okay. I won't comment on the ocean removals, as my remit is very much land-based, but I do think there's great potential there. So running through some of the more land-based options, you mentioned the afforestation, and absolutely, it's got to be the right tree in the right place for the right purpose. It's going to be site-specific. We wouldn't want to be planting trees on peat or deep peat, because we're going to lose some of the carbon from that peat if we do so. However, establishing scrubs on those peat, particularly upland peat areas, might be a great option. The improved forest management. Yes, absolutely. But it's kind of one of those, the devil is in the detail, and you alluded to that, John. It's more about the how necessarily than just the what. Okay. Soil carbon. Absolutely. Yes, please. It's one of the largest organic carbon stocks on the planet. Roughly 90% of the UK's carbon stocks are in our soils. And we know that loss of soil organic carbon can result in loss of topsoil through erosion, reduced soil structure, and increased compaction, all of which directly affect our ability to produce from agriculture. Whereas increasing soil organic carbon levels, improves the soil physical quality, it reduces erosion, it improves yield stability as well. It increases soil porosity, water holding capacity, all these sorts of things. So I'd almost argue that with regards to soils, people should be doing it anyway for all those other reasons, but be cognizant of the carbon benefit as well. But I'd almost say that the driver there is those other reasons rather than the carbon. And I think it's worth mentioning as well that conservation practices may increase carbon sequestration levels, but also they may not. It does depend on the soil type and the situation and what the carbon levels were to start with. I really enjoyed seeing the reference to biochar as something novel, and maybe what is novel here is the scale at which we're talking about deploying biochar. We know that we're still digging up effectively biochar from thousands of years ago, so it can persist under certain situations. I think it's also, and you do allude to this, John, which I think is great. The biochar is more about the storage than it is the sequestration per se. The sequestration happens at the point of photosynthesis. The use of the biochar is more about storage. Biodiversity and ecosystem services with regards to biochar, again, I think yes, but it depends on the soil type and the situation. We know that biochar does a really good job in terms of bioremediation, and I'd like to see more investigation into we know it also does some reduces nutrient leaching and diffuse pollution from pesticides. Is there further that we could look at there? And then finally, enhanced rock weathering, magic rock dust. Who doesn't love a bit of magic rock dust? From my point of view, I think the geochemistry of this sequestration is pretty well understood, but there's areas that we need to know more about. So we need a robust process for MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification, but also looking at the fate and behavior of those carbonates. If it's producing carbonates in field, how much of them actually make it to to the ocean for deposition there? And is there any impact on the soil biology or soil chemistry, good or bad? And furthermore, if we're going to be growing crops on land that has had enhanced rock weathering applied to it, then what's the impact on crop agronomy? Again, positive, negative, and also crop quality as well. Be that edible crops or other crops. And again, with the biodiversity and the ecosystem services, I think that is again going to be site specific, or actually it's probably going to be very specifically soil pH dependent. So I shall finish my my reflections there, but I've enjoyed this very much. Please ask some questions.
Thank you, Harley. Really interesting to hear. Now we are moving to the Q&A session. We have plenty of time. We received some great questions, so let's dive in and try to cover as many as we can. And I'd like to highlight one question, whether a GGR technology that does not actively enhance biodiversity but still protects or preserves it relative to a baseline should still qualify as a nature-based solution. And any thoughts on that from you, John? And then maybe Ruth and Harley, if you want to come in after.
Yeah, so in the kind of the criteria for a nature-based solution to result in a net gain, yeah, that can involve protection as well as restoration. So ideally, you are assessing what is the loss or the risk for biodiversity in your area and understanding what the drivers are, and then your nature-based solution could be, yeah, just to protect or avoid some of those drivers, and then your demonstrable net gain to biodiversity is your protection versus a business as usual where it would have been lost. Where it gets tricky here, and where on the carbon side as well it's been tricky and we've seen some controversy, is establishing that counterfactual can be very hard and very easy to critique. So we've seen in some of the reduced deforestation carbon credits that people have said, well, you were getting these carbon credits for not deforesting, but there were forests next door that weren't deforested either without those carbon credits. So there are ways to resolve some of this and being conservative in what you're getting out of it. So in principle, yes, it can apply to protection, but having confirmation of the counterfactual is difficult there. Where it is probably not really a nature-based solution is if you're going beyond the kind of system boundaries of your immediate MBS. So there are sensible arguments that any carbon removal is hopefully supporting nature and ecosystem function just in general by mitigating climate change and taking a fraction of however much warming we have, which will hopefully mean a reduction in the kind of negative feedbacks we see, less forest fires around the world. So this is all sensible and a reason to do climate change mitigation, but I don't think it would really count as an MBS unless you've got within the boundaries of the project intervention something which is directly benefiting biodiversity, whether that's through gain or protection.
Okay, thanks, John. There is a question on flora. The focus on flora is very logical. How do fauna fit into this picture? Ruth, what is your take on this?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question because I think it fits in really nicely with kind of how we have to think about, I guess, these systems holistically. And, the role of fauna within that is obviously very important in kind of building habitat diversity. And we're a nation that's very much kind of driven by grazing animals, be it kind of by livestock that we see kind of much of now, but in the past by other forms. So, kind of bringing in, kind of considering, I guess, the different kind of trophic levels of habitat restoration and management is going to be really crucial in terms of kind of understanding that resilience. We can't kind of look at these systems in isolation. And I think kind of looking at fauna around that kind of helps us look beyond that as well. So I think in terms of nature-based solutions, kind of understanding all the different levels of these habitats and ecosystems is really crucial. Yeah.
Thank you, Ruth. I see another question on whether nature-based solutions projects should be evaluated not only on a project-by-project basis, but also over time through their life cycle. And what do you have to say about this, John?
Yeah, so I think this is a question from Navraj, isn't it? So yes, I think we do need that, and it is actually one of the other criteria of the nature-based solutions standard that your management should be adaptive and responsive based on evidence. So I think you do really, if you're doing it really properly, you should be committing to routinely monitoring and changing what you're doing if the circumstances or the evidence change. And I also think this is where there's a role for MRV to hopefully generate a kind of virtuous cycle where not only is this what you set out to do to be an MBS, but also if you're, whatever your incentive for the carbon removal is, whether that's a carbon credit or some kind of combined carbon biodiversity credit, that also puts in place regular monitoring and reporting, which is at least covering some period into the future. But I'm not, have to recognize that there are challenges there. And one of the criticisms for the nature-based solution standard is that it does set a very high bar in kind of understanding the drivers, almost sort of locking you into management commitments, which is very hard to see how you're going to get a business case for if it's perpetual. And this is something from a kind of ecology side as well, that when we're trying to look at the costs for some of these carbon removals, it's reasonably easy to get the cost of the initial project set up, and it typically comes out quite favorably compared to engineered approaches, or at least it does if you bring in the other benefits. But it's very hard to get accurate estimates of what's the kind of long-term commitment in terms of land management, continuing to put fences up, paying for wardens to monitor. So there are challenges there, and I don't think we have solutions to all of them. But in principle, I think it is important that we're tracking these things over time as well.
Thank you, John. There are questions around the measurement of carbon levels, also removals versus reductions, solutions for this. Any thoughts? Harley, would love to hear from you.
Thank you. If I can get off mute. Yes. Okay. So there was a question about accurately measuring carbon. I'd say that in almost all these situations that we're talking about, carbon can be measured, very robustly and accurately. Whether that's soil carbon measurements or carbon in biomass. The issue is it tends to be quite costly. So the other important thing is that there's been, significant improvement in methodologies for estimating carbon in different situations as well. And for me, the best sort of estimation goes along with where you have both measurement and modeling into the situation. So you do some measurement and then you sort of model the rest. So that's that one. And then there was a question about the relative importance of carbon removals versus carbon reduction. And in my lofty ivory tower here in Warwickshire, I always tend to think about best practice sort of being to look at reductions first. Do as much as you can to reduce emissions as far as possible, and then use removals to mop up the rest. And part of that is because, one, it's about efficiency, and two, if you're able to reduce emissions, you're not just reducing emissions for that year that you're doing the reduction. It continues forwards in time. You're removing, that reduction continues forwards into time. So if you think about, entire industry like agriculture, agriculture will never have zero emissions. We don't want agriculture to have zero emissions, but and in fact, if all the UK's emissions were just from agriculture and land management, I think then we've won, okay? But we do want to get them to as low as we can. And it goes hand in hand with the efficiency of those operations as well. What tends to be good for carbon also tends to be good for farmers' profitability as well.
Very, very interesting. There is another question here. How can society optimize increasing carbon sinks and delivering increased ecosystem integrity in a changing climate, and how important is the resilience of any removals in this balance? So a question around resilience. Ruth, what is your take on this?
Thank you. And hi, Peter. Thank you for that question. I think the resilience is absolutely crucial. You know, a lot of the actions that we're putting in place, you know, we're thinking around kind of what the climate is now. And actually that's going to look very different in the coming decades. So kind of making sure that we build in that resilience is absolutely crucial to kind of mitigating loss. And again, following on from Harley's point, I think, you know, it's around kind of reducing those emissions first, kind of protecting what we have before we start going after the sequestration. And I think, you know, a lot of actions are going to do this. So, and I think, again, it kind of rolls on from the previous question that was around reductions versus removals. You know, in our 7th carbon budget advice, you know, kind of one of the big hitters in terms of land use and reducing emissions is around peatland restoration. What actually that does, though, peatlands don't become a net sink in our pathway. They remain a net emitter. It's just their net emissions are much, much smaller. So that's absolutely crucial. And I think the other thing, really thinking about resilience and building that, is that it helps these systems adapt and change with time. We're kind of giving them a chance in this changing climate. We are going to see very different landscapes over the next, you know, 20 years or so, but we're giving them a chance to kind of adapt and move with that. So yeah, I think kind of having that, I guess, no regrets approach to protection, kind of protecting what we already have, is just going to be really key.
Yeah, there are many great questions. I'm trying to navigate here, and I see, let me see. So there is one here on the implementation. NBS implementation should be driven by co-benefits, not for removals. However, the current policies seem to prioritize removals over co-benefits. So any advice, thoughts on how can we bring nature and NBS co-benefits in the political agenda? Any of the panelists who would like to comment on this question?
I'll have a go, Alina. Albeit with a little bit of a caveat. So I won't comment on the political aspect of it. I'd say that when I was talking about the soil carbon and the co-benefits almost being, you know, the bigger driver, that was specific to that one. But I do think across the board, it's important to not look at anything in isolation. You know, and all these nature-based solutions are brilliant because they've got such strong and good co-benefits. They're good for climate. They also tend to be good for air quality, water quality, creating habitats and biodiversity as well. So there is real strength there. You say that it appears to be that we're looking more at sort of actually, let me just try look at the question again. So the current policies seem to prioritize removals over co-benefits. I'm not sure that's true, but it might be a matter of perception, and I can't comment on your perception. But I do think that they go hand in hand. As much as we are trying to reduce emissions, we're also looking at options for removals as well. Something like land management, whether that is agriculture and land management or land management not in agriculture, it's a really difficult industry to decarbonize. And that's largely because we're not, unlike other industries where the primary greenhouse gas is CO2, you know, which is almost a direct equivalent for energy, which is a very direct connection to money. In terms of biological systems and land management, we're looking at CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide. And it's just a much more complicated picture with regards to how to reduce emissions there. It's a big challenge and we're up for it. And so I'd say from my point of view, back to my lofty ivory tower, we are definitely looking at reductions and removals. I hope that answers your question.
We are almost finished, but still we have time for one more question, and I'd like to ask John how to transform the way conducting research and institutional operations to incentivize interconnected socio-ecological impacts and policy engagement.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one because I think we've got two things happening and needing to happen in parallel. So one is on kind of like the policy and decision making is to make sure that we do actually join up things like biodiversity targets and climate targets and how we manage land to get there. But I think we also need to do that as researchers and try and take an interdisciplinary approach, so that we're also not providing the kind of narrow answers, because that's what then gets fed onto the narrow decision making. So I guess the GGRD hub and core have been very nice projects to work on, because we have a hub doing some of this kind of synthesis research, but it is partnered with different demonstrator projects. So we've got people focused on field trials for particular removals, but then meetings and updates where we can talk across each other as well. And hopefully we will see increasingly broaden interdisciplinary research in the future as well. It will still be hard to translate that to policy. I guess, yes, without making it too awkward for people in government, I think it is probably true that there are multiple ambitions. It's not that our policies are deliberately narrow, but from my side, I think the government it's got climate targets and biodiversity and ecological targets, but as the office report kind of in January each year, we're not necessarily making as good progress to bringing up or meeting some of the wider environmental targets. So yeah, just a recognition that we do have these multiple aims and it's going to take work to achieve all of them.
Great, John. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but before we finish, I'd like to invite each of our great speakers to wrap up 30 seconds, 1 minute maximum, better 30 seconds, to share your takeaways from this discussion. We start with Ruth, then Harley, and John.
Thanks everybody for such a really enjoyable discussion. I guess my takeaway really is that while we have a clear definition of nature-based solutions and how they align to CDRs, there remains challenges in translating them from definition into delivering them in practice. And what's going to be really key is kind of having site-specific, supporting those on the ground to do this in a really effective way. So hopefully that's my 30 seconds.
Okay, I'll jump in. Takeaways. It's a really fascinating area. There's a lot of interest here. There's a lot of support for this area as well. We need to keep on keeping on, and we need to bear in mind at all times that however complex the system, the clarity and simplicity of messaging is really important. John, over to you.
Yes, yeah, I'll try and keep it very brief and say, even though we've sensibly captured lots of the nuance and challenges and uncertainties, there are also obvious options here that are kind of no regret, where we may not know exactly how much carbon we're getting, but we're pretty confident that it's doing some good for climate and nature. So this is a sensible starting point and can be encouraged.
Well, thank you very much, Ruth, Harley, and John, and to all of you in the audience for listening and for your great questions. As I mentioned earlier, a recording of today's webinar will be available on the core website and shared with you all. And just a quick note, our webinar series will take a short break over July and August. We will be back on Wednesday, September 10th, from 12 to 1 UK time. The next session will focus on MRV and sustainable GGR, so keep an eye out for the registration details in the follow-up email. Thanks so much again, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and if you are in the Northern Hemisphere, Please stay safe during the heat waves and enjoy the summer break as much as you can. And we are looking forward to seeing you all again in September. Bye-bye.